What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be revisiting the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy in late 2022. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch 120Hz Super AMOLED display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 405, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 85.4% screen-to-body ratio. So in honestly every way, this display is great. At 6.5 inches, it's definitely on the larger side, which is a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content, but at the same time, it's still compact enough to be decently comfortable for most people to use. And with an aspect ratio of 20:9, we are getting a decently tall and narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something like browsing the web, using social media, something like that, with a form factor like this, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. And then of course, with the 1080p resolution, everything is going to be nice and sharp, and the Super AMOLED display gives us really nice looking colors, great brightness, and the viewing angles are really good as well. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, this phone is going to be quite a lot easier to see than something like an IPS LCD, for example. And if that wasn't enough, with a 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is going to be a little bit faster and smoother than average. So if you're doing something like watching a video, playing a game, or just using the phone in general, things are going to be nicer and more fluid, and the phone overall is going to feel more premium to use. So if you're looking for a mid-range phone that has a really good display, not only is this phone going to be a great choice, but honestly for a budget phone, I feel like this is one of the best choices on the market. Now for storage, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G is getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and there are also other variants out there that have 256 if you really want more storage. But that being said, keep in mind, if you are in the US, most versions of this phone you get through a US carrier are going to have 128 and not 256. That being said though, 128 is definitely a pretty good amount of storage. Sure, it's not the best in the world if you're really a power user, especially considering nowadays flagship phones can even have as much as 2 terabytes. But at the same time, considering this phone is around $400, probably even less if you get it through a carrier, I do think you are getting a pretty good amount of storage, especially considering unlike a flagship phone, this phone actually does have microSD card expansion. So whether you're a power user or even more of a moderate user, if you are looking for a mid-range phone with a good amount of storage, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G is going to be a pretty good choice. But that being said, again, keep in mind, if you're constantly downloading apps, especially things like games that tend to take up a little bit more storage, then you might want to get the version of this phone that has 256GB. But again, in general, for almost everyone, I feel like 128 is going to be perfectly fine. Now for security features, this phone does have Face Unlock, as well as a nice looking fingerprint scanner right here in the display. So let's go ahead and give it a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, that fingerprint scanner was real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, this phone does have Face Unlock, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, we got a real nice looking hole punch design for the front facing camera. This camera is 32 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a full quad camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 5 megapixel macro camera, and a 5 megapixel depth sensing camera. For video, this phone has a max recording quality of 4K in both the rear and front cameras. And this is definitely a nice thing if you're recording a lot of videos, maybe for YouTube for example, and you want to get the best resolution you can. And as far as the actual camera features go, this phone has pretty much everything, including an ultra wide camera and a macro camera. So whether you're getting those wider angles or you want to get really close up detailed images, no matter what kind of pictures you want to take, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G will get the job done. And as far as the actual photo quality goes, if you want to see a real detailed breakdown of this, I do actually have a full camera review of this phone on the channel, which I will be linking to in the description. But in general, as far as photo quality goes, for a mid-range phone, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G is honestly one of the best. Sure, on one hand, compared to something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra or even an older flagship phone, this phone is still not at that level, and since it doesn't have a telephoto lens, the zoom is not going to be nearly as good as some of the higher end devices. But in general, again, for a $400 phone, you're really not going to get much better than this. Now as far as RAM and processor go, with the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the Samsung Exynos 1280 processor. Now keep in mind, there is another variant of this phone that has 8GB of RAM, but this phone in this video, as well as the ones you get through US carriers, does have again 6GB of RAM. That being said though, it's not really going to make a huge difference, but it's still something I did want to clarify all the same. Now as far as the actual performance goes, for a mid-range phone, this is a pretty fast fast device. On one hand, compared to a higher end device, like the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE for example, this phone is not going to be nearly that fast. And even when compared to an older flagship phone, like a Samsung Galaxy S10, the A53 5G is still not going to be anywhere near that level. Because at the end of the day, even though it is pretty fast for what it is, it's still very much a mid-range phone. Now, that being said, when it comes to basic daily activities, like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and honestly most forms of mobile gaming, despite again not being nearly as fast as a $1,400 flagship phone, the A53 5G definitely will get the job done in most cases. So on one hand, if you really want a super high performance device, then yeah, sure, you might want to spend a little bit more and get something like an S21 FE, but I would say for most people, if you're just doing normal basic activities and you're not really doing anything too crazy with your phone, the A53 5G is going to be plenty fast enough for you. Now I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and here's what I got. What I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone will be an upgrade for you. But in general, I would say if you're coming from more of an entry-level phone or maybe an older mid-range phone, chances are this phone will probably be a pretty decent upgrade. But again, if you're coming from a higher-end device, especially one of the older flagship phones, then again, keep in mind, while this phone does have pretty impressive performance for what it is, it's still not going to be quite at that level. For the battery, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 25 watt fast charging, making it one of the better batteries you can get. In the US, that's pretty much the largest battery you can get in a smartphone, and even outside the US, it's still one of the largest. So if you're looking for a phone that has really good battery life, maybe you're not always going to be around a charger, and you want to make sure you have something that's going to last all day, in that kind of situation, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G is going to be a great choice. In addition to this, with 25 watt fast charging, while it's still not the best fast charging in the world, for a phone in this price range, I would say overall it still is pretty good, and in my experience, this phone does charge up pretty fast. For the software, this phone currently has Android 12, and I imagine it will be getting Android 13 pretty soon. In addition to this, knowing Samsung's software support, you can also expect a couple more major updates for this phone as well. So if you're someone who likes to have the latest version of Android, getting a phone like this is going to be a great choice for you. In addition to this, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G does have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using Tap and Pay, you'll be happy to know you can do that with this phone. Now, another thing about the design I want to point out that some people are probably not going to be too happy with is that unfortunately, this phone does not have a headphone jack. So if you want to use a regular pair of 3.5mm headphones, this is going to be a lot harder to do. But that being said, keep in mind, it's still not impossible, and with the right adapter, which I will be linking to in the video description, you can technically still do it. But honestly, if you really do want to use normal wired headphones, it still is probably going to be a little inconvenient, even with an adapter. And if I had this phone and I were in that situation, I would personally just get a pair of wireless headphones. But if you don't want to do that, it's definitely understandable. And in that case, you might want to consider something like the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G that is actually pretty similar to this phone, but that phone does have a headphone jack. But otherwise, if you're not too concerned about headphones, then obviously this isn't really going to be a big deal for you. But in conclusion, is the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G still worth buying in late 2022? As you probably already figured going into this video, I would say yes it is. At this point in 2022, pretty much all the competitors have released their versions of this phone, their upper and mid-range phone that is. But honestly, in my opinion, compared to those phones like the OnePlus Nord N20 5G and the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G for example, I feel like the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G is still one of the best options. Sure, this phone doesn't have the largest display, and it's not really significantly faster than the competitors, but I feel like everything, from the balance of features, to the performance, to the camera setup, and even the design of the phone itself, is really just right for a mid-range phone that has the capability to do pretty much everything the average user needs without being gimmicky or overpriced. So in general, if you're looking for a mid-range phone that has great performance, a really nice display, plenty of storage, a good camera setup, a large battery, and features like NFC, and you want that premium feel, but you don't want to spend a ton of money on a flagship phone, I do think the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G is still one of the best options in late 2022. Now, once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.